Okay, now, in all fairness, I have to say there are other estimates as to when that will happen. And the two on the right, I mean, some say, okay, it might be a little bit more, it might be a little bit higher. There's two estimates that are much higher than that, or at least two estimates that are much higher than that. The blue one and the green one that I'm showing come from the United States Geological Survey, but we know who signs the checks for those people. So I think those numbers have to be considered as relatively dubious. Okay, and there's one more problem, and that is the following, and that has to do with global production. We walk around in the United States, we beat ourselves over the head about how much oil we use and everything else, and we use more per capita than anybody else. But if you look at the curves of the growth of oil production, we're actually not doing so badly. We're the blue line, okay? We're, you know, it's going up, but it's not terrible. But look at the green line. That's the so-called developing countries, little places with populations like China, India, Brazil, and Indonesia, okay? Look at the rate of increase from those countries. This is China's oil consumption, all right? It's on the order of about 2 million barrels per day in 1986. 10 years later, it's close to 4 million barrels a day. And in 10 years after that, it's over 7 million barrels a day. It doubles every 10 years. This is exponential growth. And this is something that I think we really have to understand. This is not a U.S. problem. This is a global problem. We're not going to, as previous speakers have said, we're not going to be able to just go in, march in there, and grab the oil and come out because other people want the oil. Okay? This was a picture I took when I was in far western China, in the Taklamakan Desert on the Silk Road. We went in for lunch in a restaurant and came out, and there were a dozen SUVs parked out there. Okay? Except for certain groups of people in the Middle East, most people would love to have our lifestyle. They want to drive an SUV, they want to live in a single-family house, they want to wear Levi jeans and Armani suits, and they want to eat McDonald's or something equivalent to it. Most people aspire to a much higher standard of living than they currently have. And this is part of the equation. Okay, just to give you an example, this is change in oil consumption since 1965. We've only gone up 79%. China has gone up 3,000%. And behind China, you have India, Brazil, Indonesia, and everybody else, or most of the other so-called developing world. Okay, and this is the problem, because remember I did that calculation and I said maximum output's going to be about 100 million barrels a year. Okay? If you look at this projection of demand and you ask where do we come out with 100 million barrels, we hit 100 million barrels just about 2016. So just at the time that we reach peak oil production, demand will equal peak production. And at that point, demand will exceed the maximum production we could ever possibly have. And the take-home lesson is that in about 7 years, we will exceed maximum total oil production. And at that point, I don't know what's going to happen. Okay? It seems to me that this is an equation for perhaps incredible political, social, economic, and whatever upheaval. Because if you've got a commodity that everybody wants and there is not enough of it to go around, you've got problems. And so this is not just a U.S. problem, it's a global problem. And let me just do one more thing. This is per capita oil consumption in 2003. And again, in the United States, particularly on a college campus, people go around, beat their breasts about, not beat their breasts, beat themselves over the head about how much oil we use, and why can't we be like the Europeans? You know, they use half the oil that we do. Okay, so let's say this is the disparity with the rest of the world, but also why can't we just be like the Europeans? So let me ask you, are you ready to make the ultimate sacrifice? Okay? The ultimate sacrifice, as I've defined it at this point, is cut your oil consumption by half. Live like a European, okay? Eat wine and cheese, and I just spent 6 months in Paris. It was great to live like a European. Didn't have a car either. All right, were you really willing to live like a European? So what I say to my students is, if you're willing to live like a European, which 2 of your family's 4 cars are you going to get rid of? Which 3 of the 6 televisions? Which half of your wardrobe? Are you willing to give up most of the meat and processed foods that you eat and eat only local fresh fruits and vegetables with occasional amounts of fish? Are you willing to make all of those sacrifices? And after a little hesitation, usually they say yes, and say, okay, now what are the consequences of that? So let's say we reduce our oil consumption by 50%, and we take all the oil that we're saving, and this assumes constant production. I'm not talking about depletion, just constant output, okay, for the next 5 years. And we take all that oil and we ship it to the rest of the world. How much are we going to increase the standard of living? Well, the problem is there's 10 times as many of them as there is of us. So if we reduce our oil consumption by, another back-of-the-envelope calculation, 1.5 gallons per day per person, and we distribute it to 10 times as many people, we're going to raise their consumption, or make more available to them, 0.15 gallons. So their standard of living goes to here. At that point, we're still using 3 times as much oil as most of the rest of the world. Do we declare game over? This is fairness, this is justice. Now, go back to China, go back to India, go back to Brazil, and be happy? Of course not. I mean, we might want to do that, but they're not going to be too happy doing that. And so here's another scenario. Let's say, okay, let's go for energy equality throughout the world. Everybody gets the same amount of energy. Total world is about 0.5, 0.6 gallons a day. Everybody gets that amount delivered to their home, and then they can do whatever they want with it. Well, what would that require in order to do that? That would require that we reduce our consumption by 80%. So that means you'd have to get rid of 4.5 of the 6 televisions that you own, and 3 of the 4 cars, and as I said, 80% of your wardrobe, and you'd really be reduced to eating, I don't know what, fruits and vegetables grown locally and transported by bicycle into your town. So, and the Europeans, who have done such a wonderful job with less oil than we do, have this fantastic transportation network, and everything you can get by bus to anywhere, or train or bus to get anywhere in France, for example, they'd have to reduce their consumption by 60%. And at that point, everybody would be happy, I suppose. Okay? So on that rather sobering tone, I wish you a nice day. Oh, right, exactly.